Hundreds of French soldiers at Verdun in 1916, men who had never met, stationed in different parts of the battlefield, reporting at different times, all described seeing the same figure. An old man, standing in no man's land, wearing a uniform that had not existed for 46 years.
It is February 1916. The Battle of Verdun has just begun. Within days, it will become the longest battle of the First World War. 10 months of artillery, mud, gas, and collapse. 300,000 men will die here. Nearly 700,000 will be wounded. The landscape around Verdun has already been reduced to something that does not look like Earth. The forests are gone. The hills are cratered. The soil is so saturated with iron and blood that a century later, it still cannot be safely farmed. Soldiers in this sector live in a state that military doctors of the time are only beginning to find words for. The shelling never stops. Men go days without sleep. Some stop speaking. Some begin to see things. Most who see things say nothing, because silence protects you from being sent to the rear as a lunatic. And the men here believe, with some reason, that the rear is not necessarily safer than the front. Into this world, in the first months of 1916, comes a figure that nobody can explain.
The first reports are individual. A corporal from the 46th Infantry Regiment notes in his diary that he saw, during a quiet hour before dawn, a figure standing in the shelled ground between the lines. He describes the figure as old. Not old in the way a tired young man looks old, but genuinely elderly, perhaps 60 or 70 years. The figure is wearing a greatcoat, not the horizon blue of the current French army, something darker, something that feels to the corporal wrong in a way he cannot name. He watches. The figure does not move with the gait of a soldier crossing no man's land at speed. It walks slowly, as if it belongs there. The corporal writes that he called to the figure. The figure turned toward him, he is certain of this, and then was no longer there. He tells no one for 3 days. But he is not alone. A chaplain serving in the Verdun sector begins recording in the spring of 1916 that men are coming to him with accounts of a figure seen in the battlefield at quiet intervals. Dawn, dusk, the deep night between barrages. The chaplain is a careful man. He does not tell these soldiers they imagined it. He writes down what they say. What he records is striking. The men do not know each other. They are from different regiments. They have not shared their experiences before arriving at his confession. And yet they describe the same figure, elderly, upright, wearing a dark coat with specific features, a longer skirt, a particular collar, what one man calls a keepy of the old style. One soldier says the figure carried a rifle recognized somehow as belonging to another era. One describes shoulder boards of a pattern that has not been in use since before most of these men were born. The chaplain investigates. He is trained in theology, not military history. He takes his notes to a regimental archivist, a man old enough to have served in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The archivist looks at the descriptions. He says, "That is not a uniform from this war. That is a uniform from the last one." The first explanation anyone reaches for is the obvious one: shell shock. By 1916, French military doctors are documenting what they call obusight, a state caused by prolonged exposure to artillery fire and the psychological extremity of trench warfare. Symptoms include hallucinations, fugue states, persistent visual disturbances. This explanation is reasonable. These men are living through something that reshapes human cognition. Hallucinations under extreme stress are well documented, before and since. The brain under sustained mortal threat begins to produce experiences that feel entirely real. But the shell shock explanation has a problem. Shell shock hallucinations are typically personal. The dying face of a friend, a memory from home, a distorted version of the battlefield itself. They are not shared. They are not consistent across strangers who have no contact with each other. And they do not typically produce historically accurate details that the experiencer has no reason to know. The men describing this figure are not describing a monster from a dream. They are describing a specific uniform from a specific conflict that ended before most of them were adults. They are getting the details right. That is where the shell shock theory begins to strain.
The second theory is collective suggestion, a kind of psychological contagion that spreads through a closed, high-stress community. We know this is real. The dancing plague of 1518, mass hysteria events in schools and factories across history. When a community is isolated, frightened, and closely bonded, a belief or a perception can spread from person to person as if it were a virus. Under this theory, one soldier sees something, perhaps a trick of light, a shape in smoke, an actual person from another unit, and describes it to others. The description plants a seed. Other men, primed by that description, later interpret an ambiguous shape in the same way. The figure gains detail with each telling. The uniform solidifies. The story becomes, in a sense, self-fulfilling. This is a strong theory. It accounts for the consistency of the reports. It does not require anything supernatural. But the chaplain's record's complicated. He is careful to note which men had spoken to each other before coming to him. In several cases, men from isolated positions, sections of the line with no communication between them during the period in question, independently report the figure before the accounts can have cross-contaminated. One report he documents comes from a forward observation post that had been cut off from its regiment for 4 days by sustained shelling. The isolation principle, the strongest argument for collective suggestion, does not hold uniformly. Some of these men had no access to each other's stories. A third theory was raised decades later by researchers studying extreme environmental psychology, that Verdun's specific conditions, the sub-zero temperatures, the carbon monoxide released by constant artillery discharge, the sleep deprivation extending in some cases beyond 72 hours, may have produced a specific category of shared environmental hallucination, a phenomenon documented in polar explorers and high-altitude climbers, where strangers in the same extreme environment sometimes report the same figure. This is sometimes called the third man factor, the sense of an unseen presence or a figure at the edge of vision, appearing under conditions of extreme physiological stress. Under this model, the uniform detail is less mysterious. The soldiers' minds, starved of oxygen and sleep, reach for the most emotionally resonant image available, a soldier from before, a predecessor, someone who stood in the same territory and did not survive it. The specific uniform details under this reading may be partly post hoc elaboration, the mind filling in the visual after the experience. This is the most scientifically credible explanation available, but it too does not fully close the case.
Here is the detail that no theory comfortably accounts for. Among the chaplain's records is the account of a sergeant, a man who had been a school teacher in Lyon before the war. He is described by the chaplain as skeptical, rational, not given to religious enthusiasm. He comes to the chaplain not with belief, but with distress. He has seen the figure. He has also, on his own initiative, gone to the regimental archive and looked up descriptions of the 1870 French infantry uniform. He tells the chaplain, "I have never seen a picture of that uniform. I had no reason to know what it looked like. And what I saw, what I described before I looked it up, matches what the archive describes exactly, down to the piping on the sleeve, down to the pattern on the kepi." The chaplain writes this carefully. He underlines one sentence in his notes. The sentence, translated, "He could not have known." If the sergeant's account is accurate, and the chaplain clearly found him credible, then the suggestion of cross-contamination, the theory that a planted image spread through the group, does not apply to him.
The most credible explanation, weighing everything, is a combination.
Extreme physiological stress produced visual hallucinations in men already at the edge of what the human body can sustain. Those hallucinations, shaped by the emotional landscape of the battlefield, the proximity of death, the soil filled with the bones of the men who fought here in 1870, took the form of a soldier from the previous war. Collective suggestion then amplified and standardized the image across the community, creating the consistent report that the chaplain documented. This is a reasonable answer. It does not require anything beyond known human psychology and known stress physiology. But it does not account for the sergeant. It does not account for the men who reported independently before the story had spread. It does not fully explain why, of all the hallucinations available to a traumatized mind, so many men landed on the same specific historical uniform, one they had no obvious reason to visualize. To this day, no formal investigation was ever carried out. The chaplain's records passed into a private archive and were partially published in the 1970s by a French historian whose work never received wide attention. The regimental diaries that corroborate the accounts are real and accessible and have never been systematically studied. Nobody knows what those men saw. What we know is this: hundreds of soldiers at the worst place on earth in 1916 looked out into the shelly ground between the lines and saw the same old man. And not one of them, in any account that has survived, describes him as frightening. Every one of them says he looked calm.
What do you think those men saw? A hallucination shared by hundreds of strangers? A figure from a past war standing watch over a new one? Or something that science still doesn't have language for? Comment your theory below. I read every one.